Hi folks, how you doing? I'm grateful to God for this opportunity to teach tonight. Reverend Ed Horney and I have teamed up to teach a comprehensive series on the body of Christ. And since we are still in the midst of teaching this series, I thought the invitation to teach tonight was timely and appropriate for me to incorporate tonight's teaching into the series as a special session. Ed and I currently have 22 hours of teaching posted on YouTube, comprehensively covering the different signpost words and phrases used to refer to aspects of the body, the different analogies, architectural, agricultural, athletic, and anatomical to illustrate it, and the different responses to being in a body, such as one anothering, arraying, intertwining, and now Ed and I are finishing up an in-depth job description for each of the 14 ministries in the body. And we can post a link for the YouTube if you guys want. So tonight is a special session. It's like a public X. So anyway, I had a choice of teaching tonight, session 12, about the next subject in the series, which would have been apostles and healers. But 45 minutes is not enough, so I decided to make tonight into session 13, which is going to bridge into the portion of the series concerning genuine leadership in the body, which Ed will help me teach. So, I'll teach session 12 this coming Tuesday on apostles and prophets, and that'll finish up the portion of the ministries. So here we go. Please make sure your seatbelts are fastened and your tray tables are in upright position. Welcome to session 13 of the one body of original Christianity. The body of Christ needs genuine leaders, even though it's supposed to only have one head. Consequently, if it only needed a head, why would Jesus have sought out and trained 12 apostles? Ed taught a verse last week in John 10 during his teaching on pastors that I'd like to begin with. He and I have been keying off of each other during the whole series. It's been great fun. John 10:16. Jesus said, "And other sheep I have, which are not of this fold, them also I must bring, and they shall hear my voice, and there shall be one fold and one shepherd." Ed said that when Jesus taught this, he didn't know the details of the grace administration, but he did know what he just prophesied here. We now know the identity of the other sheep that had not been disclosed then because it was still hidden in the great mystery. And furthermore, Jesus could also have been referring to the 6 administration saints, but there was no doubt who the one shepherd would be. The church still needs leaders, and that shepherd has something to say about that. The one body needs leaders, but not just leaders, but genuine leadership. Accordingly, one of the tasks that Jesus needed to accomplish in his training of the 12 was to get them to unlearn the methods and motives which were held by worldly leaders and learn how to be genuine leaders. The ancient world had gross examples of leaders who had evil affected the Jews. Cruel despots like Antiochus Epiphanes or Herod the Great, or hyper-ambitious rulers like Alexander the Great, or even ruthless rulers appearing good like Augustus Caesar. Even the high priests in Jerusalem at that time were political appointees, with all the intrigue that went with that. These all so-called leaders of men were absolutely not godly leaders. Jesus needed to impress on the 12 an important, pivotal lesson about genuine leadership. And this polar star was so important, it is covered in all 4 Gospels. So please turn to Exodus chapter 2. To introduce this subject, I think a very important fact of genuine leadership is that it is a response to an inner call. Moses was a prime example of genuine leadership, as illustrated in Exodus 2, and this is very significant. Exodus 2, verse 16. Now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came and drew water, and filled the troughs to water their father's flock. And the shepherds came and drove them away. But Moses stood up and helped them and watered their flock. Verse 17 is significant, for it really defined the character of Moses. This verse contains a unique dual first usage of both the words rise up and the word help. And this is what defines true leaders throughout history. They bravely arise to their callings to help God's people. This certainly was a lesson that Jesus had to impress on the apostles in their leadership training. During the ministry of Jesus, there were a number of milestones, key turning points, when his ministry commenced a new phase. One such key was this moment in the category of leadership. Jesus had been training his apostles, and they had done amazing things in his name, but this event chronicled when the first of the apostles really got it and really stepped up. He was to be the first one to learn this most important lesson, and God commemorated this turning point with great miracles. I teach that they were spiritual fireworks to mark and celebrate it because it was so important. Many have marveled and fixed their attention on these miracles, but have never realized their significance. The day of the feeding of the 5,000. Tonight, I aim to prove what these miracles signified. In order to recognize the true significance of this event, one must bring together the gospel accounts from all 4 gospels to focus on this one day in the life of Jesus Christ. All 4 gospels cover parts of it. And that's an indication of how important it is, because there are not many things that are covered in all 4. See, but when we fit them together in chronological order, we're going to see a vivid, detailed picture of Jesus in action that can't be seen any other way. And also, this wasn't accurately possible until Reverends Walter Cummins and John Crouch completed their work on the harmony of the Gospels. It was titled, Jesus Christ, Our Apostle and High Priest. This is a missing book. It was supposed to fit between the books Jesus Christ, Our Promised Seed, and Jesus Christ, Our Passover. But that book was quashed when they both left the organization that hired them to do the research. Walter Cummins later reworked and improved the subject and published The Acceptable Year of the Lord. This single day begins with Matthew 14, so I want you to turn there, please, with the fate of John the Baptist. And tonight we're going to need a Matthew finger and a Mark finger and a Luke finger and a John finger. So get your hand limbered up. Get ready, because it's really going to be thumping. Anyway, Matthew 14, verse 3. It says, For Herod had laid hold on John and bound him and put him in prison for Herodias' sake, his brother Philip's wife. And if you know about the rest of the story, the intrigue that occurred in the house of Herod, because of this, Satan was able to manipulate the murder of John the Baptist. And so verse 12, his disciples came and took the body and buried it and went and told Jesus. When Jesus heard of it, he departed by ship into a desert place apart. Well, how would you feel if it was your cousin who had just suffered such a terrible and infamous fate? How would you feel if you had known what a wondrous man of God he was, and now he's dead? Well, how would you feel if suddenly you're the only mature spiritual leader for the true God left, and you're alone, and you have no one else mature enough to help you shoulder the responsibility? You know, you've got 12 leadership trainees, but they're still novices. Jesus must have felt the same way. After John was murdered, I believe Jesus really needed to get off by himself for a while to deal with it. We'll see, he did accomplish that. Matthew 14 verse 12 says that John's disciples had brought the news to Jesus, so he also had to deal with the shock and sadness of them, in addition to his own. It must have been heartrending. But this was not the only thing going on. The Gospel of Mark mentions an additional element that only using the harmony of the Gospels can reveal. Look at Mark chapter 6. This will be your mark finger. Mark chapter 6. Verse 30. It says, "And the apostles gathered themselves together unto Jesus and told him all things, both what they had done and what they had taught." Well, what is this? They had just come back from their itineraries 2 by 2. Verse 31, "He had said to them, Come ye yourselves apart into a desert place and rest for a while. For there were many coming and going, and they had no leisure so much as to eat. And they departed into a desert place by ship, privately." So, the 12 apostles had just returned from being sent out 2 by 2, and they were at the opposite end of the spectrum. They were on a spiritual high. They were exuberant and enthusiastic with their success. They wanted to get together with the Master, and they intended to recount their exciting, incredible experiences of wielding the power of His name, but it was like Grand Central Station. They really couldn't discuss much. Well, if you were Jesus, how would you deal with these polar opposites? On one hand, you have to deal with the grief of John's death, but also you have 12 sky-high, excited apostles. Jesus had been patiently teaching them, and they just had their first opportunity to practically apply what they'd learned. There was educational momentum that needed to be preserved. Jesus had to help them interpret their experiences in light of the spiritual principles that were involved and show them how to do even better. So, this had to be dealt with quickly to advantage the maximum learning impact. But there was even more going on, because there were also the crowds of followers, both of Jesus and John, plus the new folks of the apostles that brought back with them. It was so busy. It was so intense. There was so much need that they couldn't even find time to eat. That really was a true Isaiah 58 fast. To make sure Jesus didn't lose this opportunity for the apostles' maximum learning and development, they definitely had to get by themselves for a while. So now, the stage is set for this phenomenal next 24 hours. Luke, here's your Luke finger. Luke chapter 9, please. Verse 10. It says, "And the apostles, when they were returned, told him all they had done. And he took them and went aside privately into a desert place belonging to the city called Bethsaida." So that's the evidence that Luke adds to the picture. It's Bethsaida. Jesus and the apostles somehow extracted themselves from that situation to get by themselves. So they departed by ship into a place about 4 miles across the Sea of Galilee, intending to get away via water to guarantee their privacy because no one could follow. And this was probably early in the morning. Then John, here's your John finger. John chapter 6, verse 1. John chapter 6, verse 1. "After these things, Jesus went over the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias." So now you have all 4 Gospels mentioning elements of this most important turning point in the ministry of Jesus Christ. It's just like those fancy maps with the plastic pages that we had in our school books when we were kids. And you can fold over all 4 plastic pages and look through them and see everything at once of that day. And this was going to be some day. What great needs were there? All the people's grief and the apostles' training needs. And not to say Jesus had needs too. I mean, John the Baptist, a great man of God, had just been murdered. Jesus must have been hurt by that. He was not detached or aloof. Hebrews 4:15 says, "For we have not a high priest, which cannot be touched with the feeling of our infirmities." He too had a heart, a big one too, and we saw that with Lazarus, and he had emotions he needed to manage. And so Jesus was alone in leadership. Well, who was going to rise up? This all, amazingly, would be resolved in 24 hours. Wow. And now the plot thickens. Turn back to your mark finger, Mark 6:33. Now we continue with this next element, Mark 6:33. "And the people saw them departing And many knew him, and ran afoot thither out of all cities, and outwent them, and came together unto him. Despite their best efforts for privacy, their departure was found out. Somebody leaked where they were going. And just like Broadway show stars or orchestra soloists trying to exit secretly out the back door, they were about to be thronged. Now back to Matthew, your Matthew finger, Matthew 14. Here's more on this. And when the people had heard thereof, they followed him on foot out of the cities. Okay, now, they had found out where he was going. There's two places that they think that this was. And by sea, it's 4 miles. By land, around the northern rim of the Sea of Galilee, is about 7 or 8 miles. Now, John chapter 6. John chapter 6, verse 2. Here's your John finger. It says, a great multitude followed him, because they saw his miracles which he did on them that were diseased. So there was a great many people making this 7 or 8 mile trek. It's incredible. Now then, John picks up in John chapter 6, verse 3. It says, and Jesus went up into a mountain, into a hilltop, and there he sat with his disciples. So if they had started out early in the morning and rode for 4 miles, took about 2 hours, this was probably about 8 o'clock in the morning when he began to sit with his disciples. And Jesus and the apostles did get some time together. They must have been tired from the recent intense work that had to be done, and they must have welcomed the time together by themselves, because John 6:3 says Jesus sat with them. Of course, we know, in light of biblical culture, that meant they spent some time doing so. Imagine what they talked about. Jesus probably got to talk about the loss of John the Baptist and now what lay ahead. John's followers needed to be comforted and helped. Plans had to be made, resources organized, leadership assigned to incorporate John's disciples into the group that followed Jesus. You know, we've been in meetings like that, haven't we? And the apostles also needed attention. They probably got some time to recount their incredible experiences wielding the power that they'd been given. And like all learners with their master, the personal attention from him was something they craved. But then something happened to curtail their time with Jesus and obstruct him from having the private time he needed. Mark 6, verse 34. And it says, Jesus, when he came out, saw much people, and was moved with compassion toward them, because they were as sheep as not having a shepherd, and he began to teach them many things. See, it says when he came out. Well, now we understand the chronology. They probably were taking a lunch break during their meeting. And Jesus went out from the assembly, and what did he see? He saw a multitude. How'd they get out here? It had taken the entire morning for them to traverse the 7 or 8 miles to get there. And that's a reasonable assumption, because the average walking speed over smooth terrain is about 3 miles per hour. This terrain wasn't smooth or level. The Gospel of Mark further indicates that people's dire need, for it said that some had run this distance. The reality of John's death had really set in, and their needs were still unmet. And Jesus saw much people. What a shock! This was amazing. And now he had to decide what to do. He could have told them, don't you people know we came all the way out here to be by ourselves? Don't you people realize that John was my cousin and I need time to grieve? Go away! Leave us alone! We need to finish making our plans so we can take care of you. But instead, Jesus set aside his own needs and put their needs first. He made the critical decision to forego the rest of the meeting with the apostles, and he turned his full attention to the people. Matthew 14, verse 14 corroborates this. Take a look at your Matthew finger. And Jesus went forth and saw a great multitude, and he was moved with compassion toward them, and he healed their sick. It says he was moved with compassion. And that is the great key. All the planning, all his own needs, and the needs of the apostles suddenly were set aside. Now here he stood alone, with the apostles meeting behind him and a needy multitude in front of him. Then with no preparation, he stepped out upon pure believing. John 6 says he began to teach them many things. That word began is a signal. It could have sufficed to say he taught them many things. But the word began was added to emphasize that this was a key turning point. Something special began at this very moment when he set aside everything else and put himself and the whole situation into the hands of God. Oh, to have been there to see that, to see how everything was about to be reversed, to see how such a crushing blow by the adversary as John's murder was going to be absorbed and the galaxy of emotions experienced and transmuted into something positive, and then to see Jesus and those around him and the multitude emerged, changed, revitalized, and victorious, all incredibly in 24 hours. It began when he stood up and set aside everything to help the weak, heal the sick, and teach the hungry. But not everyone had realized the significance of this moment. The sky-high apostles back in the meeting wanted the rest of their time with the Master. They'd gotten some special time with him on that hilltop, but suddenly he was gone with no explanation. Mark 6. Verse 35, when the day was now far spent, so he spent the rest of the afternoon. His disciples came unto him and said, this is a desert place, and now the time is far past. Send them away! Get rid of them! That they may go into the country round about, into the village, and buy themselves bread. Because they didn't even bring anything to eat. Get rid of them! They came all the way out here in the boonies and didn't even think about bringing something to eat. They didn't recognize the significance of what had just occurred. The distraught multitude had forsaken everything and run out into the desert just for an opportunity to be with Jesus. It was that important to them. Jesus responded with compassion. The apostles didn't. How can I lay that at their feet? Because they were hard-hearted. And later in Mark 6, verse 52, it says so. They must have resented the imposition of the crowd on their private time with Jesus. And the Gospel Harmony reveals that it took weeks for Jesus to deal with this. Okay, at this point I need to edit something into the teaching. I'd skipped John 6, verse 4 in the teaching last Sunday, and I need to cover this. So John 6, verse 4, it says, in the Passover, a feast of the Jews was nigh. Reverend Cummins, John Crouch, and I believe that there's a textual variant here which omits the words, the Passover. We believe that Jesus' ministry was 70 weeks long, not 3 years like most scholars do. The 70 weeks of Daniel 9 fit so well as all the other chronological information, especially with the crucifixion being on a Wednesday and not a Friday, because there's no way, no matter how you count, that you can get 3 days and 3 nights between Good Friday and Easter Sunday morning. We know for sure that the 14th of Nisan fell on a Wednesday in 28 AD, and Jesus was born on the Jewish New Year's Day in 3 BC. And then Luke also says that he started his ministry when he was about 30, so he was 29. And so you put that all together, the 70-week-long ministry fits perfectly. Now, that all is handled in Walter's book, The Acceptable Year of the Lord, and 2 appendices in my book, The Path into Eternity. So I'm not going to spend any more time on that tonight. But the 3-year ministry, guys, point to 2 more Passovers in between. The one in John 3, when he chased out the money changers, and the Passover of Jesus' crucifixion. Well, for one of those so-called Passovers, it really doesn't call it a Passover. And then this is the other one, John 6:4 is the other Passover. But that word Passover is omitted from one text and a church father quote. Now, of course, that admittedly is not very strong evidence, but there are two other problems. If it actually was a Passover, it doesn't mention that Jesus went to Jerusalem as the law requires, and he fulfilled the law, so he would have had to have gone. It's even more suspect because it was omitted from an argument regarding this very subject, the length of Christ's ministry, by Irenaeus, who was a 2nd century church father. He certainly would have used it to support his position had it existed at that time. So without these two extra Passovers, Jesus' ministry only spanned a little over 1 year. So it actually was 70 weeks. John 6 verse 5. When Jesus then lifted up his eyes and saw a great company unto him, he said to Philip, Whence shall we buy bread that these may eat? This he said to prove him, for he knew himself what he would do. The phrase to prove him, that's very revealing. It's kind of extreme, isn't it? Philip was probably one of the ones who needed confrontation the most. And it's understandable. They just experienced the tremendous and fascinating things while they were out 2 by 2. I mean, to wield the power of the name of Jesus Christ is an unforgettable thing. But it can get your head. To walk that walk requires great discipline. There are so many ways to err. I mean, there's obstructions that need to be overcome even to get to that place where one can believe to wield that power. But then, even after getting to that point, there are more subtle things to watch out for after one is successful, especially the need to stay humble. The walk of power is a delicate balance. One must precisely manage one's heart. Of course, we of all people know that, because here before me tonight on this hookup are all of you, the cream of the crop, trained, experienced leaders and highly knowledgeable believers who know the truth and have walked for God for many years. Plus, you've taken a stand for what you know is right and come out from among those who would not acknowledge their hypocrisy. And that was a brave thing to do, but it cost you and set some of you back. However, God's in the process of rewarding you with this insurance policy that awards double what you lost. The apostles needed to see things with Jesus' perspective. They did not know the key to genuine leadership yet. This is what I'm going to tell you about tonight. John 6 verse 7. Philip answered him, 200 penny worth of bread's not sufficient for them, that every one of them could eat a little. And one of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, Hey, there's a lad here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 small fish. Well, what are they among so many? Jesus continued to exhort the apostles. He challenged them all. He said, You give them something to eat. Matthew 14, verse 16 through 18. But Jesus said to them, They don't need to depart. You give them something to eat. Verse 17, Matthew 14, 17. And they said to him, We have but here 5 loaves and 2 fish. And he said, Bring them hither to me. Ooh, what's going to happen now? The apostles still had not gotten his hints that something special was coming. They'd gotten their priorities a little bit out of focus, don't you think? They'd looked forward to having Jesus all to themselves so they could experience the glories of their high knowledge. Is that really true? Well, you know, they actually did tell Jesus to send the people away hungry, right? Their own needs instead of their own callings must have been more important to them at that point. That happens even to good folks occasionally, and they need a spiritual adjustment. Imagine how the apostles' jaws dropped at what Jesus did next. I want you to put yourselves in their sandals and empathize. Mark 6, verse 39. It says, He commanded them to make all sit down by companies upon the green grass, and they sat down in ranks, by hundreds and by 50s. Boy, oh boy, they were committed now, and the apostles were astonished. What was he going to do? Luke 9, verse 14. For there were about 5,000 men, And he said to his disciples, make them sit down by 50s in a company. And they did so. They made them all sit down. Then he took the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and looking up into heaven, he blessed them and broke and gave to the disciples to set before the multitude, and they did eat, and were all filled. And there was taken up fragments that remained to them, 12 baskets. Imagine this. One by one, Jesus called them up to him to help him meet the needs of the multitude that they wanted to send away. They'd been distracted from helping. Jesus wasn't. And each of them stood in front of him and beheld his smiling face as he broke off some bread, and it grew back. And he broke off some fish, and it grew back. And then with a twinkle in his eye, he handed them to each wide-eyed apostle who'd wanted to send the people away hungry. Wow! Imagine the thoughts of each apostle as he stood ready to receive the food and watched it happen. They wanted to get rid of the people. What a lesson. How confronting. But it was also part of something positive that began that day. Matthew 14, verse 19. More corroborating information. He commanded the multitude to sit down on the grass, took the 5 loaves, 2 fish, looked up to heaven, he blessed and broke, and he gave the loaves to his disciples, the disciples to the multitude. And they did all eat and were filled. That's filled according to their appetite. And they took up the fragments that remained, 12 baskets full, and they that had eaten were about 5,000 men. Besides women and children, how many were there? It could have been 10,000 people. Imagine how this made Jesus feel. The adversary had just cut off John the Baptist, the only other man of God in the world. Jesus has set aside his own needs and plans, and instead of turning the people away, he was moved with compassion and taught and healed them. And now his Father had made this tremendous miracle available. It was a slam dunk with a 360 twist and a Michael Jordan-esque tongue stick out right in the adversary's face. Satan might succeed in stopping the people of God at one point, but more will always rise up, like Moses did, and take their place and be fishers of men and serve the bread of life. You know, people might wonder about my assertion that the bread grew back and the fish grew back in the sight of the apostles. But look at John 6:14. John 6:14 says, then those men, when they had seen the miracle that Jesus did, said, this is of a truth that prophet that should come into the world. Well, they saw something miraculous, didn't they? And those who saw it were sitting in ranks of 50s on the green grass, right? Well, how far away were they? It had been that obvious. But then a new challenge arose. John 6:15, next verse says, when Jesus therefore perceived that they would come and take him by force to make him king, now suddenly a situation had arisen that had to be stopped. Jesus was not going to be a political or military Messiah at his first coming. So he had to find a way to stop this. So, Matthew 14 verse 22, it says, and straightway Jesus constrained his disciples to get into a ship and to go before him to the other side while he sent the multitudes away. So, up, move it, mach schnell, arriba, move it, to the boats everyone. Now, apparently it was time for the meeting to break up. So the multitude saw the disciples rushing around and the boats getting ready to depart and Jesus constraining them, and they accepted the fact that they couldn't have any more time with Jesus. Well, goodbye folks, bless you, see you later. And so they all immediately departed, and the untimely draft Jesus as king movement was averted. So, Mark 6 goes on to say, look at your mark finger, verse 45, Mark 6:45, and straightway he constrained his disciples to get into the ships and to go to the other side before unto Bethsaida, while he sent the people away. And when he had sent them away, he departed into a mountain to pray. So as those boats shoved off, Jesus didn't get in. Jesus, you funny guy! Now he was going to get what he needed. Some time by himself to think and to plan and to pray. John 6 says, Verse 15, he departed again into a mountain himself alone. What a day in the Word that had been. The grief of the multitude had been turned into astonishment and deliverance. And the way in which it was all accomplished was brilliant and miraculous. Satan's crushing blow was reversed. Jesus had slam dunk right in his face. And now all the adversary could do was have a tantrum and make the wind blow. That's what Mark 6:47 says. Mark 6:47. And when evening was come, the ship was in the midst of the sea, and he alone on the land. And he saw them toiling and rowing, for the wind was contrary to them. See, he was up on the mountain, and they were down in the sea. And Jesus had gotten his time alone with the Father to pray and to deal with the realities of all the things that had happened, and also be so encouraged by those spiritual fireworks that had occurred. And now he was ready to put her in gear and slam the pedal to the metal again. And reflecting on the events of the day, he looked out from the mountaintop that he was on, and he saw the disciples still rowing far off in the windy sea. There must have been a full moon that night. Well, we know when the phases of the moon were in 27 A.D. We know when Luke 4 was, so this was probably the next full moon. I also need to insert a correction to the original teaching I taught last week. When I determined the date of the full moon, I looked up 27 BC in Parker and Duberstein's Ancient Jewish Calendar instead of 27 AD. My mistake. The full moon there was on August the 7th in 27 AD. Also, remember what I inserted about John 6:4. The word Passover being omitted would have made it refer to the Feast of the Wood Offering. John calls it a feast of the Jews, and that's exactly what it was. It was an unofficial feast of the Jews, where the common people, and not the privileged families who made money selling wood to the temple, could donate wood to be used for the sacrifices. The Feast of the Wood Offering that year was Ab 15th, or August the 7th. So, since John 6:4 says that feast was near, and the word for near, the Greek word is engus. Now, engus is spelled E-G-G-U-S in Greek, but the double G in Greek is pronounced as N-G, like an angelos. It's called a nasal gamma for you Greek fans. And you're supposed to pronounce and transliterate it into English letters as NG. You only represent it as GG if you are using Greek letters, gamma, gamma, alright? So, engus, Thayer says it means eminent. Liddell and Scott say it means at hand. So, therefore, the miracle of walking on the water had to be the night before the full moon. It still would have been bright enough to see. So, my corrected date for the original teaching is August the 6th, 27 AD. So the detail of the full moon fitting so well with the Feast of the Wood Offering is even more corroborating information. So we can tell the Bible critics who think that this incident was a myth to shut up. The detail of Jesus' seeing them afar off was only possible with a full moon or almost full moon, and this detail locks it in. As we know, this really did happen. But this incredible day was not over yet, because there still was the problem with those guys in the ship. John 6, verse 16. John 6, verse 16. And when evening was now come, his disciples went down into the sea, entered a ship, went over to the sea towards Capernaum, and it was now dark, and Jesus was not come to them. And the sea arose by reason of great wind that blew, and when they had rowed about 25 or 30 furlongs, about 3 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea, drawing nigh into the ship, and they were afraid. Well, how do you think Jesus felt when his father said, "Son, how'd you like to walk on some water?" Waters, the sea or the deep, represents the adversary's spirit realm in the Bible. And now, after all the events of this day, he gets to walk on top of them all. And he'd been trucking for 3 miles when he caught up to their boat. Mark 6, This is really something. Mark 6, verse 48, second half of the verse, and it says, and about the fourth watch of the night, 3 a.m., he comes unto them walking on the sea, and it says he would have passed by them. Hey, fellas, how you doing? See ya. But when they saw him walking on the sea, they supposed it had been a spirit. They were afraid. They were troubled. Well, how wrong can you be? Picture this. Jesus was really into it. He would have passed by them. He was walking on the water for about 3 miles. What a gas. And it wasn't a placid lake either. The Sea of Galilee was treacherous in a storm because it's small and shallow. The waves would be coming in from all directions. When I took the boat tour trip on the Sea of Galilee, when I visited Israel, I asked one of the crew if he'd been out in the water during a storm. He said yes. I asked him how big the waves were. He said 25 feet. Woo! Jesus was moving through the watery chaos, rising high and falling low, and he would have passed by those guys in the boat. Meanwhile, they too were separately rising and falling with the raging water, and off in the distance from time to time, as they both were thrust upward, the full moon illuminated something strange approaching in the distance. Matthew 14, verse 26. And when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were troubled, saying, it's a spirit! And they cried out for fear. But, verse 27, straightway Jesus spoke to them, saying, be of good cheer, it's me. Don't be afraid. And then Peter answered him and said, Lord, if it's really you, bid me to come unto thee on the water. Wow. Now from that boat of fear, someone arose. To them, that was the only safe place from the chaos and attack of the world. But one decided to step forth, and it was Peter. While all the rest were toiling and rowing, he'd been going over the events of that day, and he must have realized what really had happened. And now, in a daring moment of pure believing, Peter boldly asks to get out of the boat. He took a step forward from the rest. Well, how do you think Jesus must have felt? You know, John the Baptist was gone. He was the only one left to lead, and all he had were these 12 blokes who were still wet behind the ears. God, please give me someone to help me. My time is limited. I need someone to give the mantle to. Now someone was rising up. Yes, Peter, come. And he said, come. Matthew 14:29. And Peter was come down out of the ship. He walked on the water to go to Jesus. All Jesus said was one word. And Peter got out of the boat. How many words would it take before you would do that? Matthew 14, verse 30. And when he saw the wind boisterous, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried, saying, Lord, save me. And immediately Jesus stretched forth his hand and caught him and said, Oh, you of little faith, wherefore didst thou doubt? See, when Peter got out of the boat, he was looking at the Lord. And he took his first steps, and he did the same, but then he got distracted, and the raging sea got the best of him. All right? Well, fear cheats us out of so many wonderful things. But all we have to do is look at the Lord and keep the Word in our mind. And His example is valid for us. And the Word is the antidote for fear. So Peter did walk on the water a few steps before he got distracted and began to sink. So then what did Jesus do? Did he shout, sink, you sucker! You failed! You ain't got what it takes! No. He took his hand and they walked on the water together back to the boat. You know, that had to be what happened. It wasn't bing, and they were both in the boat right next, right? They had to walk on the water together to get back to the boat. Would you take Jesus' hand or sink? That boat supposedly had been the only safe place in the midst of the worldly chaos. But Jesus said, come, get out of the boat. Come to me and get out of the boat. Are you in a boat? Are you in a supposedly safe place in the midst of the chaos of your world? Well, then I say it's time to get out of your boat. You have a calling in the body of Christ, and the people in the world with all their needs are drowning out there. When I visited Israel in 2001, our tour took us to many biblical sites, including the possible site for this. And true to form, there had been layers of churches built on the spot. And the tour guide launched into his spiel about all the stuff. He mentioned a recent discovery of a mosaic floor of an early church that was found nearby. And he said the floor had a picture with only 4 loaves and 2 fish. Well, we all know there were 5. And then he told us that there was a tradition associated with this, and it was, you are the 5th loaf. Of course, I was there thinking, oh, gee, I've been filled to the brim with all the tour guides' religious stuff and traditional claims at each site, and I was starting to think badly about this, and then all of a sudden I said to myself, shut up, Nessel. There must be significance to this. I mean, there must have been some deliberation that went into the design of that floor. It wasn't done at a whim. So there's got to be something deeper here. So I changed my attitude right then, and I prayed for understanding. Later on, we visited the obligatory novelty shop. I was there, and they were selling T-shirts depicting the mosaic of the 4 loaves and the 2 fish. I decided to purchase one for my wife. When I returned to the USA, I presented Marcia with the shirt and the explanation, you are the 5th loaf. And I could see the wheels start to turn in her mind. 2 weeks later, she told me she figured it out. We are the 5th loaf. We have to be broken bread for our people. And then my mind exploded. That was the key. You see, I had researched these famous miracles based on the gospel harmony that Walter and John had done. And originally I taught a different version of tonight's teaching, A Day in the Life of the Lord Jesus Christ, and I'd done so a year and a half earlier in November of 1999. But suddenly, all that took on new light. Because Jesus had done that. He decided to forego his plans and needs and become broken bread for his people. And his compassion was the trigger for the miracles. Did you put yourself in the apostles' sandals? Did you imagine if you were one of the apostles? Were you standing there in front of the Lord looking into his twinkling eyes as he broke off the bread and handed it to you and it grew back? He gave it to you for a reason. Would you accept it to give to the multitude in need? Compassion is the key to genuine leadership. It is the stimulus to rise up to your call and help. And then there were all those spiritual fireworks to commemorate that breakthrough in leadership. In fact, in the second instance, the second miracle of the loaves and fish, Jesus literally says the same. Matthew 15, verse 32. Jesus called his disciples and said, I have compassion on the multitude, because they continue with me now 3 days and have nothing to eat, and I will not send them away fasting, lest they faint in the way. And after this was the second miracle of the loaves and the fish. See, back with the first one, remember what I said about their hard-heartedness? Look at Mark 6, verse 51. This is after the first miracle. And he went up into them into the ship, and the wind ceased, and they were so amazed in themselves beyond measure and wondered. Verse 52, Mark 6:52. For they considered not the miracle of the loaves, for their heart was hardened. The apostles could not put 2 and 2 together and consider in their minds, put it together, the true significance of the miracle of the loaves, except Peter, whom I believe is the only one who did. Because you can't walk on the water with a hard heart. The water has to be hard, not your heart. His attempt to walk on the water was an indication of the state of his heart, and it was a signal to Jesus that Peter was becoming a real leader. God had indicated who would take the mantle after the day of Pentecost. I believe Peter understood that the key to genuine leadership is compassion. He understood the significance of the miracles. The whole thing happened because Jesus was compassionate and had become broken bread for his people. And this was a significant turning point in his leadership training, and it began when he acted on his compassion. What a vivid lesson, all embodied in that ancient, sagacious statement, you are the 5th loaf. We all want to have the joy of seeing God work. Don't you want to see miracles? Well, then turn the key. Have compassion. Let it flow. Get out of your boat. Put on your hip boots and wade in to help the young and the weak. And you will see God at work in Technicolor. And let there be similar fireworks. Be healed. Be solved. Be kindled. In the name of Jesus Christ. Bless you.